Richard at this point, Professor of Accounting Practice at Sheffield University Management School. Richard, you were shaking your head there to what Victoria had to say. There are an estimated 13,000 farmers in Whitehall today and their supporters. Are they right to be so concerned?
Well, I think I'm afraid to say they really are deeply misinformed. The first thing is that, in fact, we're talking about £3 million of relief are being available to farmers, and that's not even true, because the true figure is £5 million, because farmers are also able to claim business property relief as well as agricultural property relief. So the figures that we were hearing earlier on from somebody who was saying, well, let's include the cattle, let's include the crops, let's include the feed, let's include the equipment, all that is subject to another million for each person on top of that. And by the way, your organisation says that on their website, Victoria. So let's not beat around the bush here.
It's included.
You agree with that?
The BPR is included. It's not a separate allowance. It's included in the same allowance.
No, it isn't. It's an additional allowance, and you say so on your own website. So
and of course,
I've checked with the revenue manual. Now let's move on from that, because they are separate reliefs. One is on agricultural property, one is on business property. But the figures are reliable, and the figures are not from 1 year. The figures have come over a long period of time. But let's just stand back a minute and let's just talk about the reality of this, shall we? And let's just do some simple economics. The fact is that over the last 20 years, the price of agricultural land has skyrocketed. And I've known the price of agricultural land for nearly 50 years because I've been in East Anglian for a very long time and first prepared farm accounts when I was quite young in the 1970s, when land was going for next to nothing. And now it's going for over £10,000 an acre here. In Northern Ireland, it's £16,000 an acre, but admittedly, farms there are much smaller. The fact of the matter is, however, that we have not got data to prove that more than 400 or 500 farms a year are claiming agricultural property relief. And this has been going back over several years, and the people who are buying farms
Richard,
now
can I just
are
interrupt
the
there,
likes of Jeremy Clarkson.
Yeah,
so we
Richard,
are actually simply subsidising farms. Can I just make the obvious point? Nobody has to be a farmer. Nobody asks anyone to be a farmer. And anybody who's a farmer who doesn't like this can sell up and make over £100,000 a year.
All right, I'm going to put that to Jacob.
I'm going to
put that to Jacob. Jacob, you don't have to be a farmer. You can do something else.
Perfectly acceptable that every farmer could go and do something else, but then who's going to feed the nation? It's as simple as that.
Who's going to feed the nation, Richard?
Nobody's going to get into a business to earn nothing.
No, this is another nonsense argument, because in fact, what we're finding is that agricultural land is worth a lot of money because people are buying it. And when they buy it to claim agricultural property relief for inheritance tax purposes, they have to farm it. Nobody has ever bought a farm and left it to sit aside, unless, of course, they are claiming set aside and rewilding.
Could I leave?
Yeah, you can. Let's come in this, because you are making a lot of points. Let's let her respond to something. Victoria,
I think so. I mean, I'm kind of dying of boredom there a bit, Richard, because the fact is that you once did a few farm accounts 35 years ago. You don't do what Richard does. You don't get up every morning, put on your wellies with your waterproofs attached to that. Oh, sorry, Jacob. And you're very happy to opine on a kind of a theory of farming and a theory of agricultural economics, which is your view. And I'm judging by your age, probably the same as mine. It's a clear kind of Marxist view of economics. Let's smash it to pieces.
I'm not a Marxist. Let's stop
once you've smashed it to pieces, I think his farm is not worth smashing just so that you can try and prove your theory. That is not the way to cope with the problems. Actually, I've read your article with great interest, and I too think that there are deep-seated problems within agriculture. But killing off farming from the top down is not the answer. And so everybody protesting today was right to be there. And on their behalf, I would like to say that we resent the condescending tones that are coming from government about Jacob and me and all of the people like us just not really understanding the figures.
Richard, can I ask you, is this the right way for the government to go about things? Because everyone will know tax is confusing to the mere mortal. You are an expert. That's why people come to accountants to help them sort it out. This is a confusing picture for farmers, which is why they have come to Whitehall. You can forgive them perhaps for feeling stressed and anxious, because on one hand, they are facing this inheritance tax change. On the other, the government is saying, with a bit of planning, it doesn't have to be this way. Plan ahead. Use all the relief schemes, all the different mechanisms available to you, and you can avoid this. Can you understand why farmers are feeling anxious and confused? It doesn't have to be this way. The government could have done this another way, could they not have? If they want to close a tax hole. And as you said, the wealthy people buying up the land and pricing out farmers, generations of farmers?
Let me be clear. Young farmers should be delighted about this change in inheritance tax because it is going to push down the price of agricultural land considerably. Therefore, there will be a lot of new entrants into farming, which will considerably expand the stock of farmers in this country, which will improve our agricultural supply enormously. This is liberating for farming, which is at the moment constrained by being in too few hands, particularly the hands of the very wealthy.
OK,
so this is
I'm going to put
farming.
that to Jacob. I'm going to put that to Jacob because I want Jacob to respond to this. Jacob, Richard is saying that this measure by the government, this inheritance tax change, is actually helping you. It's going to make it less attractive as an investment for wealthy people to avoid tax. Farmland will decrease in value. There would be more of it available and farmers could expand. New farmers could enter the business. This is good for you.
Yeah, well, it's very good for someone in an office to say that. But when you've got young people that are in farming that are making at most 20 grand a year, at the very most, how, even if land prices came down to £1,000 an acre, how are they going to expand when not only over 10 years when their father or grandfather dies, they've got to pay this inheritance tax bill, but how are they supposed to then buy more land? It doesn't correlate.
Richard, can you explain that for us, perhaps?
But look, I dealt with this on the blog post and the videos that I've made today, which have been viewed by a lot of people. And what I explained was that the problem that you're then explaining, which is entirely reasonable, that farmers aren't making enough money, has to be addressed in a different way. We need price support for farmers. We need to take control of the food industry, which is destructive in this country of health and of farmers, and we know that, and put in place proper food strategy to make sure that farmers are paid for producing decent food that doesn't kill people by the time it gets to shops because it's become ultra-processed. So the reality is I'm all in favour of support for farmers, but don't, for God's sake, ask for people to believe that you're hard up when you're sitting on millions of pounds worth of assets. You're not going to win the public by doing that because you could simply sell up and sit on a fortune for the rest of your life if that's your situation. And the rest of the country.
But Richard, they want to farm. Hang on, I'm going to stop you there. Jacob, you don't want to give up your business. Sell your business and do what? You want to farm.
That's exactly it. And what's his plan when every young farmer in this country sells up? Is he going to import it from Australia, New Zealand?
No,
where does that solve the issue of producing food for a whole nation?
They simply won't all sell up. There's no evidence for this claim.
But they would have to.
Why are you all going to sell up? If we had a proper farming strategy that supported your income so you could afford to actually live properly on your farm, then you wouldn't have to sell up. And that's what I'm arguing for. Why don't you listen to this? I'm no Marxist, as I've just been abused of being. I'm actually wanting to support you in your businesses by reducing the cost of one of your major inputs, which is land. Yes, it will reduce the value of your estate for inheritance tax purposes, so you won't even have to pay inheritance tax, but you will also be able to buy more land to actually get people into farming, and you will increase your incomes if you follow what I say, and therefore it will become a profitable activity which will encourage people to go into it. So we will have a future land and farming supply for this country. Please see the big picture here. You're picking up the wrong end of the stick and you're making an argument you should never be pursuing because it's totally bad for farming to go this way.
Victoria, I'm going to bring you in on that. Richard talks about farming strategy there, and Jeremy Clarkson raised it. He said farmers need better support. Regardless of this inheritance tax issue, that was an issue before this came in. Farmers were crying out for help, for a better way. Richard, I know, is in favour of modernising farming. But there has to be a better way of doing this, doesn't there? Why haven't the government come up with a tax policy that goes after those that are specifically targeting farmland for tax avoidance? Surely there's a simpler way of doing this without having British farmers marching on Downing Street. What would you want to do, the government? Well, what would you want the government to do that would help you better?
I think there are some short-term things that the government really needs to go. Jacob was raising there's a real fear in the farming community about their older family who are in their 80s and possibly 90s. You know, the government should be looking at a way of releasing them from the 7-year rule. So if they want to dispose or hand over their land, they can do it without the fear that they might not last 7 years. That would be a very easy thing to do. But I think the government should come back to this and actually create a strategy. This was two things that happened separately. On the one hand, DEFRA took away the BPS payments down to the last 7,200 for next year. Meanwhile, in another place, there was an attack on agricultural property relief. There doesn't seem to have been any attempt to see that the farming community feel as if they're in this terrible pincer movement. Now, the ELM scheme, which you're talking about, The great thing about the ELM scheme is we're no longer vassals of the state, which I think is this picture of support that Richard was espousing. We will deliver by contract public goods for the people of this country, and we will get paid for doing that. No longer a subsidy for the square acreage that you have of land, but a payment for doing something that everybody needs. And that is a good policy. It's making ground, it's making payments. It's really badly stalled since June because of hiatus in government and so on. What the Secretary of State needs to do with the Farming Minister is go back to the Rural Payments Agency, go back to DEFRA, put their foot down on, as in get going, on the ELMS project, and actually create the farming industry that we want. We want a successful, energetic, dynamic 21st century farming industry.
Well, Richard was agreeing with you on that final point you made there, which you may be pleased to hear there. I'm glad we reached some common ground in this, because it really is good to thrash this out and get all sides of the debate, because it has got so confused. And Jacob, taking this inheritance tax issue off the table for the moment, I know it is the most pressing concern today, and it's what everyone's talking about. But you were under pressure before this announcement was made in the budget. And I just want to get a sense of how you feel about the future of farming right now. Because, you know, I was with you and your young son, just 6 months old, in the green room before we came into the studio. And I'm sure you want him to have a future in farming if he wishes to do so.
Yeah.
How are you feeling about the future for your family and the business?
I think he's very vulnerable at the times. You know, it's not just the inheritance tax that they've decided to do. They've decided to add a fertiliser tax. Like Victoria said, they've changed the de-linked payments for BPS. It's not just they're not just going after the wealthy landowners. It's quite simple. Otherwise, they wouldn't have added all these other taxes to farmers. And there is just no support. I don't think they understand what goes on a farm. It's easy for someone to sit in an office with some figures and say it's not going to affect the vast majority, but a fertiliser tax affects every farmer in the United Kingdom. So it's just nonsense to sit there and say that it's not going to affect every farmer, because it does.
OK. Well, listen, Jacob Walker, Victoria Vivian and Richard Murphy, thank you very much for talking about this issue. That's a real emotional one and a very complicated one as well.